Great. Well, thanks for joining us online today for the fundamentals of fertility management. And it's the first in the series. That'll be pretty much every other Wednesday, with some exceptions. We do have one program that will still be in person. The greenhouse workshop in March will be at Atlas Farm in Deerfield, talking about greenhouse stuff, and their stuff growing in the greenhouse seemed like good reason to go look at plants. Anyway, Sam Glaze Corcoran is our presenter today. She did her PhD with Masood Hashemi at University of Massachusetts, and then a postdoc at UMass. She is now the director of the Soil Lab, and we're very glad to have her. She's a very fun, engaging presenter. So take it away. Oh, I did want to say too, we're gonna sort of moderate the questions. So feel free to put questions in the chat as we go along, and I will kind of find the right moment to interrupt Sam. And so, yeah, just use the chat there. And also, if you have any problems, let us know. Okay.
Great. Thanks, Sue. So hi, everybody. I see some familiar names and some are new. I've kind of lived in many worlds over the last couple of years. As Sue mentioned, I spent a lot of time with Masood Hashemi, and a lot of my background is in grazing, haying, corn, conventional management systems. But I've also done a lot of work in cover crops and emphasizing, of course, in the lab, more universal recommendations for people. So today, there are two important things to know. So one important thing to know is that I am not an organic certification expert. I do not claim to be one. So there are people that are on the call today that have more expertise. So if I say something that is just not correct, or if somebody asks a question that I can't answer and you have that expertise, please pop that in the chat or flag Sue. Happy to have that additional expertise be offered for everyone. The other thing that I want to plug is that there, in part because of the shorter format, there are a couple of topics that I think are going to be really relevant to fertility, but I'm not going to get into depth covering them. So there's two webinars to put on your calendar, and I'm going to plug them again during the webinar as they come up. One's going to be on February 28th, and that's going to focus more on cover crops, which is hugely important for nutrient management. And then there's going to be one on April 24th that's going to focus on food safety. And I'll show you an example today where some of the amendments that you use for fertility are also going to fall under some food safety regulations. So it's important to be aware of that. So there's the link there. You can also just search UMass vegetable upcoming events, and you'll find the event page, and you can register for both of those links. So for today, here's what I have planned. This is going to be a crash course in soil fertility, and there's going to be an emphasis on what this means for organic growers specifically. This isn't fine detail on if you want to grow this crop, apply this much blood meal on this date. This is more for both beginners and advanced growers. If you're a beginner, this is going to give you the pieces that you need to be aware of in order to make decisions and to understand these pieces so that you can make decisions. If you're a more advanced grower, there's going to be some additional depth on some of these topics. And so my hope is that maybe you already have this basic understanding, but you're going to gain additional information. At any point, if you're on that newer side and we're going too in depth, it's okay to tune me out and come back. You'll get that high point. On the same hand, if you're a more advanced grower and you feel like we're going over something more basic, yes, we are, but there will probably be something for you soon that's going to be a little bit more in depth. So with that in mind, the first thing I want to identify is the difference between soil fertility and soil health. This is a question that I get all the time. So when we're talking about soil fertility, we're talking about this more classical idea in about the last 120-ish years of agriculture, where we're seeing soil for its ability to mediate nutrients. So the soil is sort of like a broker for nutrients. Its job is to provide the right amount of nutrients at the right time, in the right form, in order to support plant growth. So soil fertility analysis or tests that you can send off are going to emphasize the soil pH, so the acidity of the soil, the nutrients that you have. Those are both going to be firmly in this chemical circle here. But soil tests, you can routine soil tests. You can also get soil organic matter that we would consider a biological test. That's going to provide very important fertility information as well. So these fertility tests are going to tell you, are your nutrients accumulating or are they depleting? Do you have the conditions necessary to support the plants that you want to grow? If you don't have the ideal conditions, what are the recommendations to help you reach those conditions? When we're talking about soil health, we're talking more holistically or more comprehensively. So soil health is this broader idea of the continued capacity, so a sustainability element of a living soil. So that's going to be an increased emphasis on biological to support plant growth and serve the ecosystem at large. So in this more comprehensive view that we identify as soil health, there's the plant growth production, but there's also thinking about things like water quality, biodiversity, habitat. So there's many individual tests that are available for soil health. This is a huge area of discussion and study. You might come across, or you very often come across, what are known as comprehensive soil health test assessments, and those are going to include tests from all three of these parameters. The soil health tests are going to emphasize more soil management practices like cover cropping and tillage. Their primary focus is not going to be on, this is what your pH is, this is how much lime you need to add. So just a quick visual assessment to see what the differences look like for some of these popular tests. So this is an example of our UMass soil test report, standard soil test. We're going to go through this quite a bit today. But again, here's your focus on nutrients, some other chemical parameters of your soil. Whereas if you compare it to a Cornell assessment of soil health or the soil fertility test that's popular from Woods End, you'll see there's a lot of additional tests. And there can be some further ranking to help you interpret what these tests are for. So today's focus is going to be on soil fertility. But I do want to, again, emphasize soil fertility is a part of soil health. A question I get a lot is, I want to focus on my soil health. Do soil fertility tests even matter for me anymore? Yes, absolutely, very much so. And I'm going to show you today where that's going to apply and still be a part of your soil health thinking as well. So as we're talking today, we're going to use this term quite a lot, plant available nutrients. And this is another common point of confusion that I find, so I want to spend the time to talk about it. When we're talking about these soil fertility tests, and you're getting these measurements of here's how much phosphorus, here's how much potassium, here's how much calcium, that are nutrients in a plant available form. That is not all of the nutrients in the soil. This can be a tricky concept, so I like this analogy. If you look at these popsicles here, we all agree you have 6 popsicles. But let's say you have a picky kid who will only eat blue popsicles. Yes, you have 6 total popsicles, but for your kid, you only have 1, 2 popsicles that they are willing to eat. That is really similar to plant available versus total nutrients. You might have a lot of phosphorus in your soil, a lot of calcium in your soil, but our tests are only measuring the ones that your plants are going to actually be able to access and uptake. And so this is really important for organic fertility management, because with conventional fertility, we apply plant nutrients that are most often immediately available, or they're very quickly available to crop plants. But when we're talking about organic fertility management, there's some nutrients that are immediately available, but there's also an additional processing step in order to make nutrients plant available. So we're going to talk about that in detail. When we're also talking about soil fertility tests, it can be very important to know that we have different ways of measuring or estimating plant available nutrients. So a farmer that I worked with for a number of years that is a grass-fed beef producer said, Sam, I have gotten soil tests from the UMass lab. I've gotten them from the Penn State lab. I've gotten results from out here in the western part of the country. Everybody is giving me different estimates of plant available nutrients. What is going on? And when I got that question, that's when I realized that we, on the soil testing side of things, have maybe not really done a very good job of making people aware of this. And it can be frustrating if you get a soil test and then you realize you can't quite interpret it. So here's what's going on. The different parts of the country have very different soils. This is an illustration of some of the different soil classifications that we see break out. You'll really commonly hear people talk about soils west of the Mississippi River, so this half of the country, and soils east of the Mississippi River, this half of the country. So in these different regions throughout the country, scientists have identified what is the soil like, what is the climate like, and what the soil is like and what the climate is like are going to impact the plant available nutrients that you have out in the field. And so people have developed specific chemistries for different parts of the country to do those estimations. So for us here in New England and in New York, laboratories, for the most part, the university laboratories, are using what's called either a Morgan's or a modified Morgan's extracting solution. It's good to be familiar with these terms because you will see them again. The recommendations that you get from our soil tests are based on plant available nutrients estimated using this very specific chemistry. But if you go to labs like the Penn State lab or the Rutgers lab at New Jersey, or a lot of the private labs, they're going to use what's called Malic extracting solution. It's a different chemistry. Malix was developed to be more universal. The Morgan's or the modified Morgan's that we use in New England is very specific to our region. So the reason that it's important to be aware of this, and you'll see here on our test, we tell you this is what this means, modified Morgan's extractable. We measured plant available using this extracting solution. Sometimes I'll have a farmer bring me a test and say, hey, this is in this braised solution or this Malic solution. Can you give me a recommendation? And sometimes they're very disappointed when I say, not really. My expertise is in modified Morgan's. Our regional recommendations are built on modified Morgan's. So be aware of these differences. A lot of folks are going to be working with some sort of crop advisor, NRCS, extension, your organic certifier. Make sure whoever you're going to for support is going to be able to help you with the test results that you get, because you might end up getting something that's not really applicable for you. Also important, make a mental note for phosphorus especially. The chemistry is really, really specialized for phosphorus. There are certain regulations and funding programs in the Northeast that require you to have your phosphorus measured using either a Morgan's or a modified Morgan's extracting solution. So in the case of phosphorus, there are ways to convert phosphorus measured with different extracting solutions to the numbers that these tests give you, but that's not universally applicable. You can't do that for, necessarily calcium or potassium. Sometimes the numbers, they just don't exist. We don't have the calculations to do that reliably. So huge piece on soil testing. Make sure you're getting the right extracting solution. So why emphasize soil fertility at all? You cannot talk about soil fertility without talking about Liebig's barrel and the law of the minimum. It is the law. So here is what we call Liebig's barrel. Liebig was, a scientist that's known as the father of modern soil fertility. A lot of work in measuring soil fertility, developing nitrogen fertilizer. So his point was, okay, look at a barrel full of water. It doesn't matter how tall your highest planks are around your barrel. The barrel is going to spill over where you have your lowest plank. That's where you're going to get your leak. He applied this same concept to soil fertility. It doesn't matter how much magnesium you have, how much calcium you have, how much nitrogen you have. None of that matters if you're low on potassium. This is the idea that you are going to be limited, your plant growth, your yield, plant health. It is going to be limited by whatever nutrient is limiting. And so here, this is saying you don't have enough potassium in your soils, you're just not going to get that much growth. So um, we want to emphasize this because if you see a soil test result and you say, well, most of my nutrients look good, this happens pretty often. Most of my nutrients look good. I'm not going to prioritize that one recommendation for calcium or that one recommendation for potassium. That thing that you might choose not to prioritize is very likely going to end up being your limiting factor. So something that I've also found is there's all of these elements on a soil test, and it can be hard to prioritize them. And I find when people know what these elements do, they're more likely to say, oh, yes, that matters. I want to make sure I provide that. So I want to give you just a couple of quick examples of what some of these different macronutrients do. So when we're talking about macronutrients, these are the nutrients, your calcium, nitrogen, phosphorus, that we're going to find in large amounts in plants. So plants need a lot of these nutrients in order to function. So when we think about things like nitrogen, nitrogen is a huge part of DNA. Every time a plant makes a new cell, so we always think about plants in this macro way, like tomatoes and leaves, but this fruit and these leaves, they're made up of cells, right? And so every time a plant wants to make a new cell, which it has to do when it wants to make more leaves or more fruit, it needs to make more DNA. So if you don't have nitrogen and phosphorus on this most basic level, your plant cannot grow. Every single one of these cells has a cell membrane. Every single one of your cells has a cell membrane. That membrane has so much phosphorus in it. So again, on one hand, geez, if I don't have these nutrients, I can't make DNA. On the other hand, I can't even make the cell membrane that holds my cell together. Things like calcium, it has a lot to do with the actual plant structure. It's important for water regulation, and it's important for plant signaling. So if you think about how does one cell talk to another, or how do the roots of the plant talk to the leaves of the plant, calcium can be involved in that signaling. Magnesium is important because magnesium is going to affect how useful the phosphorus is to the plant. So you might think, geez, my plants seem like they're stressed out from not enough phosphorus. It could be a magnesium deficiency that's affecting their ability to use phosphorus effectively. Again, going to be involved in making cells, proteins, very important. Potassium is a really big one. It's involved in so many processes, but it's also really important for plant water regulation. And another farmer I worked with for a number of years was really unhappy with his pasture productivity. Like the grass just did not look good. He was preparing to reseed. So we took a soil test and I said, your potassium is really low. Before you worry about trying to pull up your pastures and reseed, just apply some potassium. I went back and I saw him the next year and he said, my grasses, and we looked at the pasture together, they're so much better now. I don't even feel like I need to reseed anymore. What I thought was just this failing grass stand was really just struggling from not enough potassium. And it was made a lot worse during a drought year where the plants didn't have the nutrients they needed to be able to regulate water. So when you're looking at that soil test and it's so much information, keep in the back of your mind, these nutrients are really doing fundamental things for plants that we need for growth. Very quickly on micronutrients, don't worry, I'm not going to go through this graph. I just want to make a point about it. Micronutrients, they're called micro because they're present in small amounts in plants. Yes, they are absolutely critical. There's no debate that micronutrients are critical. And they do things like helping with photosynthesis, proteins, hormones. Hormones are another way plants regulate growth and signal. So here's just one example. I mean, people really study this stuff. You add zinc and all of this complicated chemistry and biology happens that results ultimately in this is a plant hormone. So I want to make this point about the complexity and the awareness of the complexity about micronutrients, because you might think, well, wait a second, am I getting conned when I get my nutrient or my fertility test back? Because you're saying micronutrients are so important, but I don't get micronutrient recommendations on my soil test. So what's going on here? So if you see this asterisk down here, so we say, okay, here are your micronutrients, little asterisks. What does this say? Micronutrient deficiencies rarely occur in New England soils. Therefore, we have not determined an optimum range. The values that are provided, these ranges here, are the normal range that we find. So if you look at thousands of samples in New England, in general, these are the normal micronutrient levels. So in other parts of the country, certainly in other parts of the world, there can be issues with micronutrient deficiencies. But because of what our soils are made out of, the actual parent materials, the rocks, the minerals, it's just not a big problem for our area. That's why you're not getting recommendations. This is important to know because if you look at the national list of allowed and prohibited substances, this is part of the organic regulations. There's a section that says micronutrient deficiency must be documented by soil or tissue testing or other documented and verifiable method, such as approved by your certifying agent. So this can be tricky. I've had the question come up of, hey, I think my micronutrients are low. I think they're causing a problem, but your soil test isn't confirming that in a really clear way for me. So what do I do? How do I navigate this? So the first key point is if you're certified organic, you probably already know this, but it's worth repeating. Get really used to the expectation of looking stuff up and asking your certifier. Save that national program standard on your computer so that you can look up the rules to help you navigate these situations as they come up. We're going to come back to that a few times. But also in the case of micronutrient deficiencies, a few things to know. The first is there's no need to apply micronutrients for insurance unless you really have reason to believe that there is something wrong, that you don't have enough micronutrients. The good news is you largely don't need to worry about micronutrients. We just monitor them, we keep an eye on them. If you do think you're having a micronutrient problem in the soil, then we turn and we look to, okay, what are the plants telling me? So for some plants, there's really clear visual assessments. There tend to be more resources for the big commodity crops, but a lot of times you can do a Google search and it's gonna give you some initial information. So here's an example. This is in citrus leaves. On the top, what you're seeing are leaves with a manganese deficiency. So manganese, a micronutrient. This is what manganese deficiency looks like in this citrus plant. Down here, this is what a zinc deficiency looks like. In the middle, this is a combination manganese and zinc deficiency. So sometimes these visual assessments coupled with your soil test results can really help you understand, okay, I am actually seeing a deficiency in this plant. I need to take some action. Sometimes you might need a plant tissue test in order where you take an actual plant tissue sample and you send it into a lab and they say, here's how much nutrient is in your leaf. Here's how much we would expect there to be. Yes, it seems likely maybe there's a micronutrient issue going on. So this is how we address the micronutrients. Another good thing to be aware of, plant nutrient analysis, it's much more straightforward than the soil tests. So you don't have to worry as much about, oh, geez, if I send this to Iowa, are they going to give me a different plant tissue test than, the University of Maine? A lot more uniform. So when we're thinking about things like micronutrient availability, we also want to think about our soil pH. Soil pH is going to have an effect on all of your nutrients, but it's one of the major ways to make sure that your micros are in balance. So as pH of the soil changes, the amount of plant available nutrients will change. 6.5 is largely considered the ideal. So at this pH, at a pH of 6.5, we consider it ideal for a few reasons. One is we maximize nutrients in a plant available form. So if you remember our analogy from before, let's say your kid will only eat popsicles that have blue color in them. How do you increase the number of popsicles available for your kid to eat? Get more blue popsicles. Same thing. How do you get more plant available nutrients out of your soil? Well, if your soil pH is low, you're going to have nutrients in forms your plant can't get, won't eat, cannot take. If you raise your pH, the form that your nutrient is in can change, and now it's something that your plant can access and utilize. So it isn't just a popsicle analogy. There is a chart. If you email me, in the lab with questions, I send everybody some version of this chart. What this is showing you is that as your pH is increasing, so over here is very acidic, over here is very alkaline. As your pH is increasing, the amount of nutrient that is available is also increasing for our macronutrients as well as for our micronutrients. So this is where we come up with the idea that 6.5 is a nice pH. The thing that also happens as pH increases is some nutrients are going to become less available. This can very often be a good thing. So aluminum can cause plant toxicity, but as you increase your pH, aluminum becomes less and less available. This also applies to some of the heavy metals like lead and arsenic as well. So pH, very important. An interesting thing to know is we often talk about plants that are acid loving. Sometimes what the plants really are, like blueberries, is they're iron loving. So iron is more available at a lower pH. And that's why we want to make sure we maintain a low pH, because a blueberry isn't going to be happy at 6.5 because it's not going to be able to get that iron that it's looking for. The other thing that your soil pH is going to affect is your soil biology. Hugely important for soil biology. So this happens to be an example of, general fungi. They have a pretty broad spread of what they can tolerate. Here on this graph, they've used the example of actinomycetes. They're a type of bacteria. This would also be true for rhizobial bacteria, which are the ones that fix nitrogen, add nitrogen to the soil. They need a higher pH in order to be successful and in order to be active. So this is critically important for organic growers because your soil biology is going to play such a significant role in helping plants, helping nutrients become plant available. And we'll also talk more about that. You really want to make sure that they're in a good condition so they can do that job for you. So when we're thinking about these soil life, again, we're thinking about things like fungi especially are known for helping to increase phosphorus availability. Again, here's that picture of these are nodules that are created by nitrogen fixing bacteria. They're friendly bacteria. They associate with plant roots, and they will take nitrogen that's in the air. The air that we breathe is mostly nitrogen. They take that nitrogen in the air and they convert it into a form that plants can use. So these guys really important. Got to have a good pH in order for them to be effective. So I want to show you this example because I think it's so cool, because right now we're putting a lot of very good energy and resources into thinking about our soil biology. And sometimes we can forget that classic fertility can make things a lot easier for us. So this is a research paper. This one came out in 2015. This is from something called the Park Grass Experiment. It's been running in the UK since 1856. So cool long-term experiment. And what they're looking at is things like under different soil pHs, under conventional fertilizer versus organic fertilizer, under different plant diversity, how many plants do I have out there, what kind. When they looked at all of these different things, what they found for a very long time, is the main soil parameter that determined the microbial composition, so the diversity, who's there, what are they doing, and the biomass, so how many microbes are out there, was pH. out of all of these things, fertility, plant diversity, pH was the biggest parameter affecting that microbial community. So when we think about the whole soil health picture, when we categorize things based on chemical, biological, physical, really remember this overlap, because this is an excellent point of the overlap between the pH being chemical, the biology being physical, and the relationship between the two. So when we go back to our soil tests and we look at pH, okay, so now we know pH is so important, you're going to find a few pieces of information. One is you're going to find what your current soil pH is. So here, this person had a 7.3. We don't see that very often in New England, but every once in a while, it's almost always the home gardeners. They get that pH up over 7. And then, so this we're going to use to say, okay, here's your current pH. Great. What do we want it to be? But there's another important piece to figure out. How do you, when you want to raise your pH, how much lime do you need to add? So that piece of information is going to be over here in your exchange acidity. So here, the value is 0 because this pH is above 7. If your soil test was a 6.5 or 5.5, you're going to see a number here in this exchange acidity. We're going to use that number in the lab to determine how much lime you need in order to raise your soil pH. So the exchange acidity or the reserve acidity is an indication of how resistant is your soil going to be to going from an acidic pH to a more alkaline pH. So you might get a pH sample from a pH test strip. Master gardeners do pH, but you have to know this exchange acidity as well in order to be able to determine how much limestone are you going to need. I will tell you if you want to drop soil pH, because this is a question that we get often, especially if you are growing plants that do well in acid. If you know your existing pH and you know your soil type, it's just a simple chart. It's not as involved as increasing your pH. So if this is of interest to you, you can go to this fact sheet online. You can find this chart, and it's a little bit more straightforward to lower your pH when necessary. So when we're thinking about pH over time, when we're thinking about nutrients over time and soil fertility, we know that we have this fluctuation of nutrients go down, we add them, or we add lime, nutrients go up, pH goes up, down, up, down, up. This is totally normal. So when we're looking at this trend for pH, this is characteristic of New England soils. We have acidic soils in New England. They're naturally acidic, and we have lots of precipitation. Lots of precipitation is also going to cause soils to trend towards acidic. So if you're testing about every 3 years for pH is the recommendation, you should be able to catch your pH when it starts to drop into the below optimum range so that you can correct it. So we're always looking to stay in this optimum. We want to catch it, either a little before it drops or certainly once it does drop so that we can improve it. Same thing is going to happen with nutrients. Nutrients drop over time for a variety of reasons. One obvious one is whenever you harvest a plant or remove a plant, any of the nutrient in that plant, it came from the soil. You're now taking it out of that field system. But we also lose nutrients to the environment. So with erosion, with runoff, with drainage, calcium, magnesium, nitrogen, those are all can be lost to the environment. Nitrogen very quickly, calcium and magnesium over time. So this is a normal cycle that you'll see in your soil test results. Our goal is that we really want to avoid going into above optimum. Not such a big deal for pH, but it is a very big deal for nutrients. I'm going to talk about this a little bit more later, but one of the most common questions I get is, my nutrients are too high. What do I do now? And it's usually a very unsatisfactory answer, which is there's no quick fix. There are some things you can do, but it's slow. So we're always trying to stay in this optimum range. To help you understand these ranges a little bit more, optimum means your plant is going to have enough for the best possible growth. Like, you have the nutrients you need. Maybe you need to worry about temperature or water or light, but nutrients are not going to limit your growth. If you're below optimum, that means So here, this sample is very low on potassium. When we see this, we are very confident if you add potassium, you are going to see a crop yield response. You are going to see your yields increase. Right now, potassium is preventing you from achieving your yield goals. However, once you go into above optimum, what we're telling you is you have more nutrients than your plants need. It's not going to help their growth. It's not going to do anything for your plant. So again, we'll talk about that a little bit more later. Sometimes that's not a big deal. Sometimes it can be very problematic if you over fertilize and you end up in this above optimum range. So we're going to transition now. Those are a lot of the core basics. So now we're going to transition into some more specificity for organic growers. As we make this transition, I want to point out there is so much importance in looking things up and getting comfortable looking things up. So these are 3 resources I want to point out. The first is, of course, the USDA National Organic Program Standards. I've referenced that. I'll keep referencing it. It's going to give you a lot of guidelines on what you can and can't do. That's where there's that information about micronutrient rules. Then there's OMRI, and I'm going to show you some of their outputs in a minute. OMRI stands for the Organic Materials Review Institute. They're the ones that are doing a lot of the work to figure out, okay, what can you use and why, yes or no, can you use these things? And then something to keep an eye on, it's still in development, but is the Food Safety Modernization Act. You'll see it often abbreviated as FSMA, and then Final Rule on Produce Safety. Right now, there are parts of this rule on produce safety that are still being developed. I'm going to point out a couple of those, but they point to the organic recommendations to follow in their absence. So we'll talk a little bit more about that, but if you're not already aware of this, keep an eye on it, and it's going to become increasingly relevant over the next couple of years. So when we're talking about organic, I want to point out the difference on these terminologies, organic versus synthetic. So, because again, I think this can be a common point of confusion, and definitely here, organic experts, if I misspeak, please do correct me or add additional information. So when we're talking about organic fertility sources, by definition, like with this word organic, we're talking about nutrients that come from recently, relatively recently, living organisms, meaning plants or animals. So examples would be things like manure, blood, bone, compost. Those all came from things that are relatively recently living organisms. Non-organic fertility sources, which we would also call inorganic, refers to mineral or chemical fertilizers. So the really obvious ones are things like ammonium nitrate or urea, which are clearly chemical fertilizers. But then there's things like limestone. Limestone it's not considered organic, but it is a naturally occurring substance. It is a mineral substance. And if you want to really put a fine point on it, about 500 million years ago, limestone did come from a living source. A lot of our limestone deposits came from the shells of sea animals from ancient oceans that are no longer present. So that's why I also use this word, relative when we're talking about a recently living organism. So here, these are organic versus non-organic. Here's where things start to get tricky. Plants, as we said, take up nutrients in the available form. The nutrients in organic sources, we said, some are immediately available. They're already in the available form. But many of the nutrients in organic fertility sources are not in the available form. They have to be broken down by bacteria, fungi, and natural weathering processes like, the rain, the acid of the soil, in order to become that form that plants can take up. That form that plants take up is an inorganic form. So we start with this organic fertility source, our biology breaks it down, it converts it into the inorganic form, and then the plants take it up. So that specific process is called mineralization. And if you are feeling like either one of these images right now, that's normal and appropriate, because this can be kind of confusing as we start to track one, how nutrients move, but also two, the terminology that we're using. So that's why I want to make you aware of it. So when we're talking about OMRI listing and the National Organic Program standards, we start to find that the word organic has different meanings for different peoples. So if I'm thinking about organic from a chemistry perspective, it means something very specific to me. If I'm something like OMRI, organic certified is going to mean something very specific to me. If I'm a consumer, organic might mean something also totally different. And so when we look into the organic regulations, the terms that are used are synthetic versus non-synthetic. And so this is what OMRI is looking at. And if you go back to the National Organic Program standards, they clarify regulations differentiate between synthetic and non-synthetic substances. So OMRI, if almost everyone's familiar, but I think they're, it's always worth pointing them out. They review all of the materials and they determine, is this synthetic? Is this not synthetic? Super cool scientists, really thinking big picture. I see a hand raised. So if this has to do with the organic language, I want to make sure I pause.
The definition of organic when I went to school was matter that was once living and is now dead. Why don't we reiterate that?
So you have my deepest sympathies. So for the last 3 years, I'll tell you a quick story. I've taught botany for the Stockbridge School of Agriculture. And something I tell them, it's super terminology heavy. And something I tell students all the time is, if I was in charge of things, there would be different terms. So I empathize with you. These terms can be confusing. That's where you also get into these things of how recently living was it? Like limestone is 500 million years ago, recently living. So that's where we land with these terminations of synthetic versus non-synthetic. That was an attempt to alleviate some of that confusion in the language. But you got to be aware of it or else it's not very helpful. So I'll point this out, and this is why it's so worth, if you're going to be organic certified, spending the time on this terminology, because it's going to be necessary in order to navigate. So they define synthetic, something that is affected by a chemical process, manufactured, it's a chemical change. It can be really hard to figure out, okay, is this synthetic, organic or not? You don't have to do that. The good people at OMRI do that. So you can go into their materials list and you can look things up. So here, this is an example of calcium carbonate. Calcium carbonate is the active ingredient in lime. This is what's raising your pH. So it will tell you, yes, calcium carbonate, it's allowed, it's non-synthetic, and you can use oyster shell, which to the recent point, oyster shell is very recently living organic matter. There's a couple of forms that you can use in the mineral form, and then also mined limestone, that's okay. So the flip point is, again, being careful with language. Calcium oxide, you can see this is a different chemical, calcium oxide versus calcium carbonate. It's prohibited, it's synthetic. This is what's classified as a quicklime. So paying attention to that language, it's going to be important. Again, back to that point, when in doubt, ask your organic certifier. They will know, they will point you in the right direction. So that's a lot of the basics. Again, we're going to keep going on the specificity for organic growers. An important note is that conventional growers have the full arsenal available to them. All herbicides are on the table, all pesticides, all fertilizers. That's not to say that conventional growers use all of those things. Many conventional growers are very conservative, but they have those tools available. When you're an organic grower, and I see a note in the chat, it is really important to get your limestone approved by your certifier before purchase. Yes, I will echo that. To definitely always talk to your certifier. So just being aware that you're going to have less options, it's not like that's a bad thing. It's just a thing to know and be prepared for. You have to be more prepared when you're managing your fertility in an organic system. It can be more expensive. It can be less available. It can take more planning in order to have a balanced fertility program. So fertility is a main target for improvement in organic systems. There is a known yield gap between conventional growth and organic production. That's not a comment on one being good or bad or anything like that. It's a scientific fact. There are some yield reductions in organic systems. One of the things that people are working on is this fertility management, and that's why we're talking about it today. So when you're thinking about fertility, problem prevention and maintenance is key. So things like keeping your pH up. It's so simple and it is so fundamental and important. It will prevent problems down the road. Know what your quick fix options are when you need them. So we've been talking about plant available nutrients. We're going to look at some nitrogen examples. Some forms of nitrogen are going to be really slow to become available. Other forms of nitrogen, like in chicken manure, are going to become available pretty quickly. You want to have a sense of how things are going to work for you. And then last but not least, planning for the long haul. So emphasizing soil health practices. We're going to look at soil organic matter in a minute, highly connected to soil health. That's going to be a part of this big picture planning to help your fertility be successful. So we said back towards the beginning that soil fertility is the ability of the soil to provide the right nutrients at the right time. I want to look at what we mean by the right time. I'm going to show you this for corn because corn is just a hugely planted crop, and so there's lots of data for it. When we're talking about plants taking up nutrients, we're talking about this throughout the season. So here you see the months, they're planting corn in mid-May, and they're looking at how much nitrogen the plant is taking up the whole season. And we can see early on, a lot of the nitrogen is going towards leaves and it's going towards the stalk of the plant. We get later in the summer, okay, now it's taking up lots more nitrogen and it's applying that nitrogen to the grain production. In corn and a lot of conventional systems, we often do split nitrogen application, and we're going to emphasize nitrogen for a couple of minutes. So by that, we mean we might put some nitrogen down when we first plant. People call it pop-up or startup fertilizer. And then we go back in when the plant's at this kind of critical growth stage where growth is going to really start to take off rapidly. Support this rapid growth that's going to start. And if we don't, we can side dress more nitrogen, meaning adding nitrogen to a plant that's already growing. I'm getting a note that my internet is going slow, so I'm going to turn off my video so that I don't freeze. So part of the reason that we split fertility and conventional application is because we can lose nitrogen. It can just be lost from the system. So this goes back to that question of why, what do we mean by losing nitrogen? So the problem is, as we said, plants uptake nitrogen in an inorganic form. So that's going to be nitrate and ammonium. Nitrate and ammonium will be formed from organic sources of nitrogen. All roads lead to Rome. The problem is synthetic nitrogen fertilizers can be too readily available. It's too immediately available for the plants out there. And there can be competition, and that competition can be weeds. That competition can also be microbes. The bacteria and fungi in the soil will happily uptake this inorganic nitrogen and use it for themselves. Synthetic nitrogen also can be lost to the atmosphere. It can be lost to water. So you have irrigation, it's draining out of the field. A lot of effort has been put in the conventional world into creating different technologies that make nitrogen less readily available. The nice thing about organic production and organic fertility is that nitrogen is released much slower. So we're more likely to get a slower nitrogen release from an organic fertility source that we hope is going to be well timed with crop uptake, versus if I apply all of my conventional nitrogen at this point, by the time that I get to the end of the season, a lot of it just might not be in my field anymore, depending on the field conditions that year. So when we want to think about these rates of release, which are so important, there's three big things. One is this organic versus synthetic rate of release. We'll look at that quickly. the actual type of organic fertility that you're using, and then the temperature and moisture conditions for the year that you're in. I want to show you a couple of pieces of information. There are, and this is one example, and I'm going to show you a turf grass example. I doubt anyone here is working in turf grass, but it makes a nice example. So hang with me on that. So what they've done here is this green line, this is synthetic fertilizer. Okay, so this is synthetic fertilizer. This purple line, this is an organic fertilizer. They've applied the same amount of nitrogen, okay, but they're just from different sources. And then they looked at, the whole growing season for the grass. How green was the grass? Nitrogen fertilizer is a part of chlorophyll. That's what makes plants green. So the greener the grass, the more nitrogen uptake, the more chlorophyll, the more photosynthesis is how this works. So what we see with the synthetic fertilizer is right off the bat, just immediately, that fertility is immediately available. Plants get really green really fast for the first couple of weeks of the growing season. When you look at the organic fertilizer, you're seeing this grass isn't as green and it's slower to get green because it's going through that breakdown process. All of those microbes, especially bacteria, converting organic nitrogen into the plant available form. But eventually you get to a certain point in the growing season where there's not that much difference. So yes, the organic fertility can catch up, but you have to be prepared for a little bit of a slowdown or a lag early on in the season. So this does get better also with time. As you put more organic fertilizer into your soil, you're going to get a few benefits. One is that you're going to build your soil organic matter over time. That's going to contribute more nitrogen. It's going to help compensate for some of this slowdown. And it's also going to give you the benefit of, I'm going to try to turn my camera on if it'll behave. It's also going to give you the benefit of this system is not going to be at as much risk for environmental nitrogen loss. So one, that's good for the environment. Two, that's good for economics. You want to use the nitrogen you put out, but yes, there is a slowdown in availability. So when we think about now different types of organic fertilizer, you're also going to get different rates of release. So here what they're showing you is they looked at blood meal, feather meal. Pellet number 5 was an alfalfa pellet. Alfalfa is a legume, so there's lots of nitrogen in it. They looked at bone meal, and then they did a mixed product. And so the point to this is, if you look at blood meal, 20 days after you apply blood meal, about 60% of the nitrogen is now in the available form of plants, okay? It takes until about 60 days after you apply blood meal for you to get your maximum availability of nitrogen, which is about 80%. So if you're saying, Sam, well, what about the other 20% of the nitrogen I applied? That's going to become a part of your soil reserves, and it's going to become available to you either later in the year or maybe even the next year. By comparison, if you look at something like feather meal, now this isn't total nitrogen that's becoming available. This is just saying of the nitrogen you have to offer, when is it becoming available? Feather meal, when your blood meal, 80% of the nitrogen is available. Feather meal, only 60% of the nitrogen is available. Drop down to bone meal, 20% of the nitrogen is available. So this has to do with the original composition of that organic material. So also when you're planning your fertilizer, have a sense of when am I applying, when is my crop, and it's different for each crop. Things like the New England Vegetable Management Guide are an incredible resource for helping you figure this out. You don't have to know everything. People have put it in one place for you. This might influence which organic fertility source you choose to use. It will require a little bit more homework to figure out what's right for you. I'm just going to show you 2 graphs on this topic, and then I will be done with graphs. So here's an example of the effect of soil moisture. So these can look like a lot, but here's the point. This is urea. This is a really popular soil fertility amendment for conventional growers. after 2 weeks, about 60% of urea is available. It doesn't matter how wet the soil was. It doesn't matter if it's kind of dry, super wet, just right. Not a big difference on urea nitrogen availability. But if you look at something like down here, this is blood meal, and here this is composted chicken manure, you're going to see that blood meal is not really affected after a couple of weeks by different moisture. They're all releasing nitrogen the same. But early on, when things are a little wetter, you get more nitrogen. When things are a little drier, your nitrogen's slower to become available. This is something a lot of people are probably already familiar with in the field. You have this intuitive sense of, it's a really dry year. My plants seem like they're struggling to get nitrogen. This is one of the things that's going on. Here in the case of the composted chicken manure, here this is our just right Goldilocks soil moisture. That's giving the most nitrogen breakdown. When it is too wet or too dry, you're not going to get as much nitrogen as quickly. So this is something to be just aware of, because if you're seeing different results from year to year, this comes back to, is it a wet year? Is it a dry year? So this is the effect of soil temperature. If you just look at these, you'll see, and this is a super famous paper. This was like a huge deal in the organic fertility world, that this was, people figured this out and studied these trends. So you can see here, I'll just show you a couple examples. At this warmer temperature, nitrogen's becoming available much faster from all sources of organic fertility. When it gets too cold, nitrogen is not becoming available as quickly. This is hugely connected to biological activity in the soil. When it's cold, microbes aren't very active, so they're not converting your organic fertilizer. When it's warm, microbes are active. They are converting your organic fertilizer. This is another reason for slowdown early in the season. If soils are cold, that's going to prolong how long it takes for you to be getting the fertility from the nitrogen fertilizer you put down. So again, if you're feeling like either one of these people, like this is a lot of information, this is a lot of things to think about, that is a totally normal and appropriate feeling. And it's something that I think everybody goes through. Nitrogen and the nitrogen cycle is something you really, I believe, have to hear a couple of times and think about before it sets in and makes sense. So try to take what you can each time you hear about it. And over time, you will build this into your bigger plan. It'll happen naturally. So this is just a summary slide. I won't go over it too much of depth of what we've talked about with nitrogen, but you should know that yes, nitrogen is tricky. It is the trickiest of all of the nutrients to measure, to manage, to estimate, to deal with. So going into it, you should know organic nitrogen, it's going to have a slower rate of release. Temperature, moisture, that's going to affect what happens each year. If it's a really wet year, even with organic fertility, you can lose your nitrogen. It will drain out of your soil with water. That's not just a conventional fertility problem, but it's less of a problem in organic systems. And as I mentioned before, some nitrogen will release quickly. Chicken manure is famous for it. Have a sense of what products are available to you. Chicken manure can be pretty expensive. Maybe dairy manure is going to be less expensive, and it's going to be good for your purposes. So I will make this key point. When you're picking your nitrogen fertilizer, it is worth the time to sit down, read, think, plan, like shop around, see what your options are. Nitrogen fertilizer is expensive. You will get your money back on the time you spend planning it. So brief aside on food safety, I mentioned this before, the final rule on food safety is going to have some language once it's finished about animal-based amendments. So there's going to be both untreated and treated rules. So this includes raw manure, unfinished or improperly handled compost, compost tea. Right now, this piece of regulation is still being developed, and it points you to the National Organic Standard rules. I'm not going to talk about these rules today, other than to tell you that you're probably already familiar with the 90-120 day rule. that says, well, first of all, you can't apply any uncomposted manure to the edible portion of a crop. It's a no-no, you can't do it. But then there's also rules from when do you apply and incorporate either composted or uncomposted manure to when can you harvest your crop. And so Lisa McKeague is on the vegetable team here at UMass. And she, on her April 24th webinar that I mentioned before, is going to be talking more about food safety and how it relates to organic. And she's going to be giving more information about these rules that are going to connect back to your fertility. Michael, I think I see your hand again.
Yeah, I was just going to throw out that there is an exemption for a number of vegetables for manure application.
Okay, great. And so, Michael, where would you say is the best place to find those exemptions? Would it be in the NOS itself?
Yeah, it's within the document. Yep.
Great. So another plug to, if you have not sat down and read these documents, putting the time into doing that to find all the pieces of info. Or you can send Lisa an email. She's super helpful, super knowledgeable, and she can help point you in the right direction.
FSMA has 1,756 pages.
Right.
Yeah,
So maybe break it up.
No, I just say that Lisa and Genevieve also offer lots of educational programs around that, like the one you mentioned coming up in April, but also the Produce Safety Alliance certification training, which even if you are exempt, is a good way to learn what you may need to know. And even if you don't need to know, sometimes it's good to know. So don't be afraid.
Be fearful of the word exemption under FSMA.
Well, that's for another talk, Michael. Thank you.
Yeah. So, and thanks for hanging tight, everybody. I appreciate everybody. Because I do teach freshmen, I know that at about this time, people's brains start to wander, but there's only a couple more slides. And we'll talk a little bit about tricky nitrogen, and then we'll wrap up talking a little bit more about these soil test results. So, as I've been saying, nitrogen is really tricky. In fact, so tricky that it is not standard on a soil fertility test. So you see here, this person has nitrate. They've paid a couple bucks extra for nitrogen. There are certain circumstances when it's worth doing, but a lot of the time it's not worth doing, which is why we don't charge you to do it. But this is a common email I get. Wait a minute, this happens to be for a home vegetable garden. You gave me a nitrogen recommendation, but you didn't measure nitrogen. Excuse me, what is going on here? So the nitrogen recommendations on a fertility test assume that you do not have any nitrogen in your field. It is assuming that there is zero nitrogen out there. The reason for this assumption is because nitrogen is in fact so tricky. It changes forms. It's famous for changing the form that it's in. It's famous for leaving the soil. It's famous for, it can, increase from organic sources over time. If I measure nitrogen after a big rainstorm, I might get zero. If I go back out a week later and it's been warm and things have dried out, there's going to be nitrogen out there again. So it very tricky. If when I was a kid, there was this show in this video game, Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego? So if you know it, whenever I'm thinking about nitrogen, I have that theme song going in my head. Where in the world is Carmen Sandiego? Because that's kind of how nitrogen is. It's always moving around. So knowing this, what can you do about it? So first of all, if you want to get a nitrate test, you can. You don't always need that. But when you get your nitrate test, you can use it in combination with soil fertility recommendations to figure out how much additional nitrogen do you need to add. So this is just a screenshot from one of our fact sheets. I've linked this table here. You can read more about how people do use nitrate to change their fertilizer estimates. As a general rule of thumb, if you test nitrate at the right time, so beginning of the season or at that point where plant growth is just about to take off, the general rule of thumb is that if you have 30 parts per million or more of nitrogen, your soil is providing plenty all on its own through natural processes. You're not going to benefit from adding more. If you have less than 30 parts per million of nitrogen, you would likely benefit from thinking about how to get some more nitrogen into your system. So, oh, sorry, oh, thank goodness that someone else knows Carmen Sandiego since I saw it. I just saw that in the chat. Okay, so yes, nitrogen is tricky, and your nitrogen recommendation assumes there's nothing out there. So what can you do to make your nitrogen application more sustainable? Refine your plan based on your soil organic matter results. Most soil tests that you're going to get at both private labs and university labs don't include soil organic matter standard. You have to pay a couple bucks extra for it. If you are going to test only one thing extra, only one soil health parameter, make it soil organic matter. So here, this person had a soil organic matter of 5.7. So I'm going to tell you the nitrogen that you get from it for a minute, but first I want to point out, when we're talking about soil organic matter, we're talking about the stuff that makes a light colored soil into a dark colored soil. This is the really decayed, stable soil organic matter. We're not talking about these little pieces of obvious root or obvious leaf. It's very chemically different, the soil organic matter that we're looking for. Okay, so here you can see this right here is a soil with less than 1% soil organic matter. On the far right, this has 3.5%. This change in color is due to the organic matter. So for every 1% of soil organic matter that you have, there are 20 to 40 pounds of plant available nitrogen that are going to be released by those microbes during the season. You also get 1 to 2 pounds of plant available phosphorus. So that means in this example where there's 5.7% soil organic matter, this soil is going to give you between 100 to 225 pounds of plant available nitrogen this season. That's fertility you don't have to add. You now need to subtract this extra nitrogen from your nitrogen recommendation. So the next question that I get is, well, do I use this conservative number or do I use this optimistic number? This has a lot to do with, first of all, your personal risk tolerance. Some people are willing to risk not having enough nitrogen, some are not. Then there's also business risk tolerance. If it's a really expensive fertility year, you might say, my business can afford the risk of less yield. My business can't afford spending more money on fertilizer. So these very practical things are going to determine which one of those estimates you use. Also, your historical knowledge of the field is so important. If you farmed on the same land for a long time, you hear people say, I know that in this field it always behaves this way, this field behaves that way. That farm-specific knowledge is so important. So one way that you can generate that knowledge, especially if you're new to the land, is you can run a strip nitrogen test. So what you do is in one strip or one section of your field, you apply nitrogen, assuming that you're getting nothing from your soil organic matter, that there's there's no extra nitrogen. In one strip, you assume that you're getting that 10 pounds per acre from each percent, that conservative number. In one strip, you assume the 20 pounds, that more optimistic number. Do those 3 tests. You can adjust further based on nitrate results. I'm not going to go into that, but do these tests, collect some information, and you'll be able to start to build and say, okay, I know in this field, I can count on that high-end estimate. In this field, something else is going on. It's usually the low-end estimate. And then you can start to kind of calibrate what you're doing. This is a really important point on assessing your work. That's a pretty structured example. That's a really commonly used method in conventional growing. But it's important to understand what you can and cannot reliably or easily monitor. So you can know how much soil organic matter you have. You can know how much nitrate you have if you're measuring it at the right time. You can make informed estimates from these strip tests. But here's what's tough. We know that soil microbes are involved. We know they're important. We can measure respiration. We can measure who's out there. We still cannot connect what we can measure with really clear predictions of how your soil is going to behave. So no, with microbes, yes, we can measure them. Can we give you a clear prediction based on them? Not yet. People are working on it. But what you can do is you can manage the soil to support microbial health, to make sure that your microbes are happy, that they're there, that they're functioning, and that they're doing their jobs. So this is just a quick point on when I say collect data or assess your work, a picture is worth 1,000 words. People often think, oh, I have to write all of this stuff down and it's complex. Just take a picture. Sorry, my dogs are gonna bark. Here I applied nitrogen, here I didn't. All you need is that picture. Here, this is a large Dunkin' Donuts cup for scale. This is the year I learned the importance about the application of nitrogen timing, and my cover crop sucked it all up. So when you're doing things in the field, take notes, take pictures, it'll be worth it. So I'm gonna go about 5 more minutes and I'm gonna leave time for questions. I am gonna skip a few slides because I have more slides than time. Sorry, it has to do with what I wanted to do for 3 hours versus what fits into an hour and a half. So I'm gonna go a little quick and then I'll wrap up. Just want to point out, big question, this connects to that before, how much can you count on your microbial community for fertility needs? If it's legumes, 100%. If you inoculate your legumes with nitrogen fixing bacteria, you don't need to fertilize those legumes. It doesn't stop people from doing it. We still see, even in conventional growth, synthetic nitrogen be applied to things like soybeans. It's really not something you actually have to do. It's excessive. But when it comes to things like breaking down the organic matter, these are where those soil health tests, field observations, that's going to help you create your own internal assessment of how much you can rely on your microbes and your organic matter. So simple things like looking at cover crop residue breakdown. If you're seeing a lot of residue breakdown, you probably have a pretty active microbial community. You're probably going to get a lot, on that high estimate of nitrogen release. If your residue breakdown's pretty slow, your microbial community might be a little bit lazy, might not be that healthy, you might not get as much nutrient turnover. So you can start to calibrate that. And then there's things like what I hear a lot, it's especially big in the grazing world, is I want to rely on fungi to provide phosphorus. Does that happen? Yes, it is totally a real thing. It does happen. But again, it's hard to be confident when it's happening or how much phosphorus is being provided. And if you till, which there's more tillage in organic systems, it's just the nature of the system, you will break up these fungal bodies, and then you're not going to have as much fungal activity from some of the fungi that we like for things like making phosphorus available. So be aware that soil management is going to feed back into your microbial behavior. These I'm going to go through quick, and I'll tell you that we have fact sheets on all of these. So if these were questions you had, I can send you the resources. When to sample for a fertility test. A routine sample you can do any time of year. We say spring or fall because it's going to give you the most time to plan for the season ahead. Fall is best, gives you time to secure nutrients. If you're going into a new field, depending on what the pH is, you could be looking at 6 months to a year or more to increase your pH to where it needs to be. Do it, like, plan ahead on pH, give it time. It will make all the difference in your success. You can sample in season to diagnose a problem. If you, for example, think there's a nutrient deficiency, that's when you might take an in-season sample. If you want to do that nitrate sampling, talk to someone like me or the veg team, or if you're corn, someone on the crop team. We can help you figure out that really precise nitrate sampling time so that it'll be useful for you. How to sample. I won't go through this. This is sort of the high-level directions. There is this fact sheet here. I will take the time to say a soil test is only as good as the soil sample that we get. Sometimes we get samples and people say, whoa, that's weird, not what I was expecting. Then we talk about how they collected the sample and we find, oh, that wasn't necessarily a good representative sample, and they have to go out and test again. I will tell you, we've already covered all of these things for interpreting a soil test result. There are a few things remaining. I am going to skip them just because of time, but I sent Sue my slides. and she can share them, and you're welcome to email me and I can answer your question. It's about this cation exchange capacity and base saturation. Those can be a little confusing. That's on here. I'll take the time quickly to say, common question, my levels are too high, now what? So the short answer is it's like a bad haircut. It can happen in an afternoon and it can take years to months to grow out. There's no quick fix. I have too much phosphorus. What can I do? Wait and be really careful that you don't have phosphorus enter the environment, enter waterways, because it's an environmental problem. If you have something like too much, in this person's case, they have too much magnesium. So they're going to say, oh, I have too much magnesium. I'm not worried that they have too much magnesium. That's not going to cause harm to their plants. What I am worried about is that they're low in calcium and they're low in potassium. Magnesium, calcium, potassium enter the plant in similar ways. If I have too much magnesium, it's going to make these deficiencies even worse because they can compete with the uptake of these other two. So I'm going to tell this person, hey, don't worry in your case about the extra magnesium, but make sure you're taking care of potassium and calcium so you don't run into a problem. This is the kind of stuff, email me in the soil testing lab. I'm happy to walk you through, do we think there's going to be a problem? How can we manage it? It's very case by case, and the chemistry can feel overwhelming when you're trying to do it on your own. So sometimes there will be harm. It depends on the nutrient. Like if aluminum's high, yeah, we know that's bad. If magnesium's high, there's no good definition on how high is too high. We have to then start to look at plant symptoms. Do they seem stressed out? We can't know from a soil test alone. There was a request to calculate fertilizer amendments. I'm sorry, I am going to stop so that I can make one last plug and give time for questions. I will say it's on these slides. There are fact sheets. Everyone struggles with this. I don't take for granted that math is easy or intuitive. Again, try to work through these or send me an email if you want somebody to check your numbers and reassure you. It's something that it becomes easier once you go through it. So on this page, I've given you an example. Here's how you can use algebra if that's how your brain works. Here, there's a little bit more of a straightforward equation if that's what you prefer. And I will end on this slide and say, there wasn't enough time to talk about cover crops in nutrient management. They're so important. They're going to hugely impact your nutrient management. Arthur Siller is the soil health educator at UMass. They are going to be presenting in 2 weeks on cover crops, also in this webinar series. Again, you can register, and they're going to continue some of this conversation about cover crops and nutrient management. So I will pause there. Sorry that I ran out a little bit of time, but here's my email. I get so many emails, I can be slow to reply. You can also reach me at this soil test, this generic email. It's co-monitored by Kirsten in the lab. And so sometimes she nudges me and says, hey, you haven't replied to this email. So that can be a good one to be emailing as well. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much. And I will let Sue moderate the questions if there are any.
Yeah, thank you. That's so much information in such a short time. There so far is just one question, so do feel free to pop them in there. We can go through them one at a time. We have about 10 minutes. The first one is about how long it takes something like feather meal to become available to plants. And feather meal is one example, but are there rules of thumb or places to go to get that information?
Great question. So I'll show you, I happen to have it on this one. And if there aren't questions, I can go back and do things like the calculations because I know that was a request. So here's an example of feather meal. So this is telling you that about 15 to 20 days after you apply feather meal, 60% of the nitrogen is going to become available to plants. So that means, let's say, your crop needs 100 pounds of nitrogen. You have to factor that calculation into, okay, is this 60% at about 15 to 20 days after I plant or transplant going to be enough for my crop? I mean, in the case of feather meal, you don't really have a choice, right? Because blood meal is about the same. But something like blood meal blood meal is so popular because in one season, you get about 80% of the nitrogen, whereas feather meal in season, you might only get 65% of your nitrogen. So blood meal would be an example of sort of a quick fix. Like, this is quick, it's available, it's ready, but it can be very expensive. Feather meal is something that is going to provide you some nitrogen this year and also help build that soil organic matter and soil nitrogen over time. So this will be an example of where it's important for, say, a cover crop, which Arthur will talk more about, to help make sure that nitrogen sticks around. So in the case of are things like this easily accessible? I mean, this is from a scientific paper. I know that that's not that accessible. So Sue, can I kick back to you and ask, is there like a fact sheet on this that we can point people to?
Well, there is a section in the New England Vegetable Management Guide. The whole, if you're not familiar with this book, I should have one right here, but what just here? Anyway, it's a big book, but the whole first half of the book is cultural practices and kind of soil. There's a big section on soil. There you go. And there's tables that sort of rate the different amendments as far as like medium, slow, or fast mineralization. So that's one place. And then I don't know, it's a question I have too. And then another question we get a lot is, okay, so say I'm growing tomatoes and they're in the ground for several months, but I'm an organic grower and I'm putting down my fertilizer before planting. Then most of my fertilizer is coming out right in the first month. How do you make a plan for the long term? Like, you could side dress again if those plants aren't on plastic, but yeah, what are the kind of staggered approaches to meeting a crop need?
Yeah, and the staggered approaches to meeting a crop, I mean, I will say that is one of the tricky things. I think that's one of the pain points in organic management versus conventional. Is in conventional, I can go out at any time and I can apply something plant available and I can really control it and it's really precise. And that's part of why people have been so dependent on conventional is because of some of those ease of management things. In organic management, what's so important is that reserve of soil organic matter, because in the background, in addition to all of this that's being released from your organic fertility that you might have added, you're also getting all that background mineralization of your soil organic matter. And in an ideal system, you're getting enough of that slow rate of release from organic matter. You have enough biological activity that this is your startup fertilizer when plants are like really getting off and running. They need a lot to get started. And then you're getting that mineralization from your organic matter, from your organic fertilizer for the rest of the season. I do think it's trickier to do that side dress, but also if anybody has knowledge of easy side dress products and organic systems that are OMRI approved, if somebody in the audience, I'd be interested to hear that.
Any other questions from folks? Okay, we're all friends here, so no question is an appropriate question. So Laura, who's with UMass, saying Nature Safe is a favorite, 1300. Is that feather meal based?
Was that a question for me, Sue?
Oh no, I was asking.
Oh, okay, okay. I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah, it's kind of a blend, but I think largely a lot of it is feather meal. So a lot of the blended fertilizers will have some of each maybe chicken manure, chicken and feather meal and some bone meal or blood meal to make more of a rounded blend that people can use. Justine, you go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, I have maybe not the smartest question, but I use compost and I have goats and I feed them kelp and organic minerals. Does any of that, the minerals, go back into my soil? And is there any way of knowing if it's working?
Yes, that is it's a great question. It's like a whole slide I deleted because there's not enough time. So Justine, you've hit on this really big thing, especially in integrated livestock and vegetable production systems. So just if you Google, there's this great chart. Nutrient balances on farm and on-farm nutrient cycling. You're going to look for the name Quirin Ketterings, Ketterings, at Cornell. She has this awesome diagram that she shows of where nutrients come in from off-farm, including things like off-farm feed, how they cycle through animals, through the manure, into the soil, into the feed. So if you're growing feed on your farm, that then goes back into your animal. If you're exporting, say, like goat's milk or goat's meat, you're then exporting nutrients. So super excellent question. The short answer is yes, all of that is cycling. And that's another level you can start to think about. They call that your whole farm nutrient balance. And this is, again, a really important thing that we look at for forage because if you have a nutrient deficiency in your soil, you're likely going to have a nutrient deficiency in your plant, which is then going to affect your animal's health.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, another question from Libby. Do soil temperature and moisture impact the percentage of applied nitrogen that become part of the reserves? So maybe like what is mineralized or not?
What a good question. You have a future as a soil chemist. So yes, it does affect it. People, and it's this is what people study in such complex ways. So the short answer is yes, it does affect it. Temperature and moisture are going to affect what is going to be plant available. It's going to affect how much your plants are taking it up. And then it's also going to affect what else, all of this other stuff happening in your soil is going to come into play and put it into more long-term storage. Some of that more long-term storage is literally the body of the microbes. As they break things down, some of that nitrogen, that phosphorus, it becomes a part of the microbe's body. And when the microbe itself dies, that becomes a very stable part of your soil organic matter. So this is something people are working on getting better at predicting. It's still a little messy, but it's being worked on.
Another question about using different source material for compost, depending on maybe the crop or what you're planning to grow there.
Yeah, so the biggest thing that I see go wrong with compost is that it doesn't get tested. So you can send your compost out for a test. It is not the same as a fertility test. At UMass, we don't do compost testing. I usually point people to either UMaine or Penn State. All of the Northeast soil labs are friends. We meet, we share methods. So if we don't do something, we point to the other labs. They'll give you a compost assessment. Something I see really often is actually people with very high nutrient levels, and they say, well, all I did was add compost. And they were surprised that, maybe their compost didn't have a ton of nitrogen or phosphorus, but oh, wow, there was a lot of calcium, or they put in a lot of leaves or something, and now calcium is really high in their garden bed. So if you're going to use compost, do get a fertility test on your compost and treat it like you would a fertilizer. What very often happens is compost or a lot of organic amendments are not what we would consider to be balanced fertility. Again, that's not like a negative comment about them. It's just how we think about these things. So I'll give you a quick example. A really popular fertilizer is a 10-10-10. No stupid questions. If you're not familiar with what these numbers mean, this is telling you, this stands for nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. It's always that order. It's always NPK. This bag has 10% nitrogen, 10% phosphorus, 10% potassium. So the other 70% of this bag is either other nutrients or inert materials. We can blend, when we're doing conventional, we can make balanced fertilizers. When you're working with organic sources, it's just the natural ratio. And so you might not be, so what we have happen with manure a lot of the time, for example, is there's more phosphorus than plants need in cow manure. So if you're applying based on nitrogen, you end up meeting your nitrogen needs, but it's not balanced for what plants need. So you put on too much phosphorus. And that's how we find there's fields all over New England. Phosphorus is supposed to be on the upper end, 14 parts per million. We get nutrients results for phosphorus over 200 parts per million. And it goes back to, was it an organic fertility source? Yes, but it wasn't balanced. So that rule applies with compost, it applies with blood meal, it applies with manure. Do factor that into your fertility plan.
Another encouragement from Laura to get your compost checked, or let's see. Check their supplier is approved for organic use. And do not use black earth compost. I don't know, Laura, if you can unmute, you want to say more about that?
Yeah, so you can use any compost except for black earth compost in the fall, as long as you're 90 to 120 days from the harvest in that field. If you're planning on using compost during the growing season in between successions, then it does need to be approved for organic use. And the list that I gave you, there are some local ones that are approved for organic use. The reason black earth is prohibited is because it has plastic in it. And once it's used, you would have to wait another 3 years before applying for certification.
Thank you, Laura.
Well, we still got a lot of people on the line, so if folks don't have other questions, we can hop off, unless Sam, you want to go through any of the stuff that you skipped over.
So because it was requested, I will just quickly, if everybody's okay, I'll go through these fertilizer amendments calculations. If you're not interested, I will not be offended if you hop off. I'll just, again, before you hop off, remind you my email's here. You can get in touch with me. Happy to help or help point you to the right person. So,
and I put in a little survey in the chat too that helps us plan these things and get funding to keep offering them. Go ahead.
Cool. So, and I do apologize. In my head, I wanted to do it. These are nice to do in a worksheet and on a chalkboard together. Math over Zoom is not that helpful always. So, we'll go through this math together. And again, let me make the qualifying statement. My brain does not naturally do math. I have to sit down and think about it. And so if you're feeling that way, that's okay. Don't feel bad or embarrassed. That can be a barrier to asking questions. And it's fine. I'm really happy to help. So as we talked about, these numbers are always talking about the NPK ratio. So something that we see a lot, or that I have to remind people of, is it doesn't mean that there isn't calcium in this bag or magnesium in this bag, or there can be, depending on the type of fertilizer you're getting, there can be other nutrients. So do always flip over the bag and look at the back of whatever you're buying. This is true for conventional and organic, and see what other nutrients are in that product, because you might be applying some sort of sneaky fertility that you didn't think that you were. So let's say you get a soil test and it says you need 20 pounds of N, 20 pounds of phosphorus, 20 pounds of potassium. That's great, because we can turn this into a ratio. And this is what we're talking about with a balanced fertilizer relative to your plant needs. This 20-20-20 is the same as 1-1-1. It's a 1-to-1-to-1 ratio. 10-10-10 is also a 1-to-1-to-1 ratio. So this is a dream scenario. My fertilizer is in complete balance with the ratio that I was recommended to apply for my crop. So now all I have to do is figure out how much of this amendment do I apply. I'm going to show you two ways to do this. I like algebra. That word sends people into like middle school trauma and they turn off. But here is why I like algebra. My brain says, I know I need to add some amount of this product that has 10% of each of these nutrients that I want in order to get 20 pounds of the total nutrient that I'm applying. Okay. So that some amount that I'm trying to figure out, that's X. That's the algebra piece. So 10% of some amount, again, this 10% is coming from this 10%, 10%. 10% of some amount of this fertilizer is going to equal the 20 pounds that I need, the 20 pounds of N, the 20 pounds of phosphorus, the 20 pounds of potassium. This is the classic solve for X. So first, you turn this 10% into a decimal. Again, no assumptions about math. To convert 10% to a decimal, you're dividing by 100. That's how I got this 0.1x. So now it's 0.1x equals 20 pounds. You divide both sides by 0.1. That leaves you with x equals 20 divided by 0.1, x equals 200. That means if I want to apply 20 pounds of nitrogen, 20 pounds of phosphorus, 20 pounds of potassium, I need to use 200 pounds of this 10-10-10 fertilizer. If you find, let's say, a 20-20-20 fertilizer, you would need half as much because it's more concentrated. So those are how those numbers start to relate. This is another way people like to do it. The calculation is the pounds of nutrients that are recommended. So here are those recommendations divided by the percent nutrient in the fertilizer. So these are those numbers times 100. That is going to give you the same answer. Just the mistake that happens here a lot is you're not converting this 10% into a decimal. You're just leaving it as 10. If you make that decimal change, you'll get the wrong answer. So the other thing that I want to point out on this is a nice example because the ratios are in balance. But let's say your recommendation comes back and you need 20 pounds of N, 10 pounds of phosphorus, and 10 pounds of potassium. This is a typo. This should say the ratio of what you need is now 2-1-1. It's not 2-1-2, it's 1-1. So if I want to add, this math got a little bit messed up actually, so maybe the slide's going to mess you up. But so let me tell you this. The point is, when the ratio of the nutrients that you need changes, you need to find ratios of fertility that are going to match what you need. Because again, what often happens is you find yourself over applying one nutrient or under applying another nutrient, and that can get you into trouble. So a big rule of thumb, and I'll make this my last point to take home, is it's okay to go a little over on potassium. Potassium is a well-behaved nutrient. It stays in your soil. We actually like to build up potassium. We like to apply it when potassium's cheap. That way, if next year it's expensive, it'll still be in your soil. And it's not going to cause any environmental harm. So potassium is one you can go a little over on. But things like phosphorus, you do not want to go over on. You do not want to use an unbalanced fertilizer. Same with nitrogen, because they can harm your plants. They can cause environmental issues, and phosphorus is one of the big ones. Once it's in your soil, it is gonna be there for a long time. And if it leaves, it can leave by entering water bodies, which causes big environmental problems. So paying attention to these nutrient balances is really important. So all in there, and I don't have anything else unless that brought up any questions or.
Yeah, no other questions in the chat, so I think we can wrap it up. Thanks so much for sharing all of your knowledge. Well, not all of it, but a lot of it in this short presentation. And we'll try to get your slides and put it up online. And thanks everyone for coming out, and maybe we'll see you in 2 weeks.
Bye, everybody. Thanks, guys.